Hey, everybody, this is Tony Robles, and welcome to Listen and Be Heard Radio for Readers and Writers, also known as the Audio Garden. Today, we have a very special guest that has written a new book on a musical and cultural icon. Everybody knows him as Elvis Presley, but it's a very special and very significant and um, very focused lens on the career of Elvis and the African American performers that shaped him and influenced him. I'm going to read from his biography. Preston Lauterbach is the author of the American music classic, The Chitlin Circuit, as well as two secret histories of Black culture, Beale Street Dynasty and Bluff City. He has also co-authored three memoirs with significant figures in Black music, including Brother Robert, and that was co-written with his stepsister, bluesman, the stepsister of bluesman Robert Johnson, Timekeeper with Memphis soul drummer Howard Grimes, and The Spirit of the Century with the Blind Boys of Alabama. His works have earned a Book of the Year recognition from the Wall Street Journal, NPR, and Rolling Stone. He lives near Charlottesville, Virginia. Preston, thank you for coming on our program today.
Well, I don't have as many gold medals as Billy Mills, but that little rundown sounded all right.
Fantastic. Hey, I wanted to ask you, I came upon this book, this brand new book here at the Hendersonville Library here in Hendersonville. And what I wanted to ask you was, what got you interested in, doing such a deep dive in Black music slash Black culture? Because I know you have several books on that subject.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a lifelong exploration for me that oddly enough started with being an Elvis fan as a kid
Mm.
and first listening to songs like That's All Right, Mama, Hound Dog, Mystery Train, and so many others that originated with Black songwriters or Black performers, and that I only accessed through Elvis. And so as I matured and learned about the roots of some of these pieces of music, and then got a little deeper and learned about the people behind them, that kind of paralleled what I was doing with my work on the Chitlin Circuit, a title that you mentioned earlier, and in some of the other areas that I've explored and written on. And so then when the Elvis biopic came out in 2022,
Mm. Yeah.
there was an interesting scene that showed Elvis hanging out with, I think it was like Little Richard, Sister Rosetta Tharpe, Big Mama Thornton, BB King. I think Prince was there. I mean, it was like it was a little bit unrealistic in that respect, but no, it was really interesting, but it kind of condensed, those kinds of relationships into one little convenient package, I think, for viewers to process. And then a lot of critics and a lot of fans came out after that and said, "Well, we really want to know more about who these people were, what is their story, and then what is their connection with Elvis." And so it all just came together, part of a lifelong journey and then kind of a pop culture moment.
Yeah, I remember the movie that they kind of zoomed in on the friendship or the relationship between Elvis and BB King. I
Right.
haven't read that many books on music aside from David Ritz. He had
Yeah.
biographies of Marvin Gaye, which I think it was called Divided Soul, which
Yeah.
I think is kind of a masterpiece. I mean, that is just a deep dive. I think he did Marvin Gaye. He also did Ray Charles and Etta James.
James. Yeah.
Um, is the approach in writing about music different than, let's say, writing on other topics? Do you approach it differently?
Oh, well, I think so. Yeah, absolutely. You're talking about artists, and so I think that too often, you hear a song and it's a commodity to you. It's something that you think it's like a bar of soap or something like that. Like it has always existed, it's always available, it's just there. You don't think about what's behind it necessarily. But there are so many layers of story that go into a single song, and so you really do have an opportunity to to pick all that apart as a writer. Um, and you mentioned David Ritz. His process is really cool because he gets to work with all of these folks firsthand and hear their stories
Yeah.
and you know piece together a narrative based on what he's told. And like for me, I'm piecing together a narrative from all the little bits and pieces of evidence that I'm uncovering as a researcher, whether it's, interviews I've done, interviews someone else has done. The music itself, of course, can be very illuminating in certain respects. Um, Newspapers, stories. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff that can go into the process. So, like when I was doing the Chitlin Circuit book years ago, there's this great artist, Louis Jordan, who's really kind of the father of rock and roll as it evolved. And I remember just kind of kicking myself in the backside saying, man, if you can't put everything into this book that he is putting into those songs, you got no right to do it. And so the musicians really serve as an inspiration.
Well, I remember one of the lyrics to his song was, "If you don't want a fist in your eye, and go to the Saturday Night." I guess that could apply to writing the book in truthfulness and everything. I wanted to bring up setting because I know that it's a big part of the book, and in reading the parts that I've read, it's obvious that you did a lot of exhaustive research. But I want to go to something that Gil Scott-Heron had said in one of his albums. It was a song called Bicentennial Blues. I just want to read a little bit from it.
Yeah.
Gil Scott-Heron writes, and this was actually a spoken word piece on a album that he did in 1976 with Brian Jackson. And he says, some people think that America invented the blues, and few people doubt that America is the home of the blues, as the bluesicians have gone all over the world carrying the blues message. And the world has snapped its fingers and tapped its feet right along with the blues folks. But the blues has always been totally American as apple pie, as American as the blues, as American as apple pie. The question is why? Why should the blues be so at home here? Well, America provided the atmosphere. So setting is a big part of the book,
Yeah.
time period and convergence of like
Yeah.
secular, religious, political, technological, and
Yeah.
artistic.
Ringo.
Talk about the epicenter and what gave rise to Elvis's influences. I'm thinking Memphis, but if you can speak on that.
Oh yeah, of course. And Memphis is absolutely critical. I don't think Elvis would have been Elvis anywhere else because he really is, I know he's this transcendent talent, and that's I think ultimately what people gravitate to him for is that he's a terrific singer and interpreter of song, and the ladies like how he looks and so on. But there's more to it than that, which is that he really was a student of music and of culture, and he absorbed all of these terrific influences. And so had he been in, you know, Vermont or something like that, not to just take a random shot, but if he had been in Alaska, he would have had different culture to immerse in, and it would not have come out the same. But as it was in that setting, particularly in the last year before his first recording, you had so many terrific things happening. You mentioned spiritual music. So Elvis was a huge gospel fan, loved the gospel quartets. And it just so happened at that time that an African American minister, who's one of the main characters in the book, a man by the name of Reverend William Herbert Brewster,
Brewster,
oh,
yeah.
yeah, opened his church to white people against, the segregation law of the city at that time. And so Elvis was among the fans, the white fans who went into the black church in order to listen to the music. So that was a unique thing that would not have really been available in too many places.
Mhm.
Um, he also hung out in the clubs on Beale Street, and Beale Street at that time had, decades of history and development to it of creating, this highly competitive, highly professional atmosphere for musicians to really be damn good in.
Mhm.
And Elvis experienced that. Um, and then in terms of Memphis being kind of a multicultural city, not in the way we would think about it today in terms of international population, but you had, people from different rural parts of the country who gravitated to the city and brought with them, what they called then hillbilly music, white country and western, and the blues. And so here he is just in this vortex of all of these different musics that existed pretty separately. You know, white music and black music had their own, you know, radio stations, live shows, their own totally separate acts, and they just didn't blend all that much then due to racial segregation.
Mm.
But as an artist, Elvis liked all of these things and so was able to effectively combine them in a way that was unique and really stood out at the time. And as I said at the beginning, would not have happened had he been in, you know, San Diego, where I grew up, or any number of other places that had different sort of cultural mixes going on. And then you throw in, like you mentioned, the technological aspect. Radio, you know, was just blowing up. And so as a kid down in Mississippi, Elvis had been hearing this massive 100,000 watt, I believe, station out of Nashville, which was the first station to really broadcast rhythm and blues records. So again, he's like right in the right place at the right time to hear all of these different musics and be part of all these different influences.
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, you're from San Diego.
Yeah.
I'm from San Francisco, so we got a connection here. I actually did go to San Diego once. I visited Croce's because
Oh yeah, old school.
I'm a fan. I'm a big fan of Jim Croce. I figure, can't go to San Diego without
I don't know
taking
if it's there anymore, but yeah, it was
a
definitely
trip.
big when I was growing up.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, the point you're making about, had he been in Vermont, you know, mystery maple syrup train doesn't quite
I
make, and then,
like
and I can't really hear him singing North to Alaska. Do that to
it.
Johnny Horton, right?
There you go.
You know, but can you talk a little bit more about the radio too? Because you had that powerhouse out of Nashville.
Yeah,
I know that, that had to have been an AM station because
right.
you could get, stations from down in Canada, up in Canada all the way, across the country here. I think it was WDIA, and they had people there that were instrumental in at least breaking some of the segregationists
Oh, for sure,
things
for
that were
sure.
going on. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and so that's two different phenomena. Really, you got three different really important phenomena in radio when it comes to Elvis as an influence, and then just as it ends up being an important influence as a whole on American music. So the blowtorch out of Nashville was WLAC. And the funny thing about that station, of course, it always had the powerful transmitter, but it was a CBS program station, and so all they had was kind of like normal blah national programming that you could hear anywhere. Well, when they started putting on local disc jockeys who then were persuaded. There was one guy in particular. His name was Gene Nobles. He was an old carny. Okay, and so he would broadcast out of an insurance building in downtown Nashville on the 10th floor or something like that. A little old school radio studio. And one evening when he was getting ready to broadcast, some African American soldiers, World War II veterans, came up to the office where he was broadcasting and brought in, some records of like Duke Ellington, like some of the boogie woogie, piano players, Big Joe Turner, Wynonie Harris, the rhythm and blues stuff, and said, "Hey, would you mind playing some of our records?" And the guy said, "Yeah, sure, why not?" So he puts these records on, playing R&B, and this was 1946, and they didn't realize the reach of that music or of their broadcast power until they put on that music because they started to get letters from all over the country, from
Mm,
as far away as Texas, Florida, from down in the Bahamas. I mean,
wow.
so because they had that clear channel signal, and I think they broadcast overnight when a lot of the other stations were down, and so it might be the only thing on the air for thousands of miles, at midnight. But the point is, people responded to this music and said, yes, you got to play more of this stuff. This is great, which is interesting. That's always been the reaction. I'm studying right now, I'm studying the really the evolution of black radio for a project I'm working on right now. Everywhere black radio turned on, first all black station in Memphis, first black owned station in Atlanta, first black DJs in Chicago, the response is always overwhelming. They're always vaulted to the top of the ratings. You go to New York City in the 60s Frankie Crocker was the single
Yeah.
most listened to DJ in the entire country.
Hey, if you went to Oakland, California, Bob Jones at KDIA, Lucky 13, and
There
then
you
you
go. So I
expand
mean,
it.
it's all Black radio is always so successful,
Yeah.
because it's offering something that's quality and something that's different. And that's my take on it. But that's kind of what it did in the marketplace at that point. And so getting back to WLAC, it wasn't black on air talent, but it was that black music that was so exciting and just so it's explosive. It was so different and so new. And this program went from 15 minutes a night to 30 minutes a night to selling 3-hour blocks to where you had within a year you had like 9 hours, 6 or 9 hours of R&B radio programming coming out of WLAC in Atlanta.
Mm.
Boom, the next year or so, 1948 in Memphis, you have the first all black radio station, white owned, but programmed around the clock with gospel music, with rhythm and blues music, with farm and home ec reports, for the wives and for some of the rural folk who were listening. And that station at the time, in their advertising material, claimed to reach 10% of the African American population of the entire country. So again, you have another phenomenon there. And this is happening right in Memphis. And so Elvis was listening to, you mentioned earlier, his buddy B.B. King. Well, B.B. King got his start as a disc jockey on WDIA. So he would spin records and he would play live. And other artists who Elvis came to admire would had 15-minute live radio spots where they would just do part of their show and then say where their next gig was, or advertise whatever beer it was who had sponsored them or had a call, the kind of patent medicine that was basically tequila.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's just such a cool time in radio. All this really great stuff was happening before things got clear channeled to death, and it's kind of all the same anywhere you go. But again, like that's the value of culture. That's the value of things being different, of things being people having freedom to do something that's unique. Um, Another radio phenomena that happened there in Memphis was this hillbilly guy named Dewey Phillips, a white dude, and he was probably the first person. He had another one of these phenomena. He went from a 15-minute time slot one night a week to 3 hours a night every night except for Sunday, and his show was called Red Hot and Blue. And so he used it, I think, as a platform to get people to come to the department store where he worked, because he sold records out of the record department. So that's all he would do, is divert it into a commission. And then, it became bigger after that. But I mean, it's such humble beginnings for these huge things. But Dewey played hillbilly records, he played African American gospel, and he played black rhythm and blues. And so it's really rare for, formatted radio to pull from those different genres. And he had an insane personality that everybody really loved.
Mm.
It's unpredictable. Nobody knew what the heck he was going to say next. And so everybody was just glued listening to this guy. Well, he promoted, as I mentioned earlier, Elvis was one of the white fans who went over to Brewster's church to listen to black gospel. Well, Dewey Phillips promoted that on his airwaves. And so that made everybody know it, and that made everybody want to do it. And so it became, getting back to Memphis as this unique space. Well, it's because all of these people are there. It's not like, I hate hearing people say, well, there must be something in the water when you have a phenomenon going on in play. No, it's people who are doing things, who are taking the initiative to provide something, or who are creative and are expressing their creativity. And that's what makes it special. That's what makes a place special. So yeah, all of these kind of lightning bolts were striking just at the right moment.
Mm. And then, using radio as a platform to have that kind of ubiquitous kind of reach, a lot of, B.B. King and Rufus Thomas,
Yeah, right.
radio person. And then also, the late Sly Stone, rest in peace. He was a disc
Yes.
jockey, KSOL
Right.
in San Francisco. Your book features or focuses on a few artists in particular that Elvis listened to, and artists that shaped what he later on became, namely, let's see, Little Junior Parker, Big Mama Thornton, Arthur Big Boy Crudup, and Calvin Newborn. Yeah, if you could talk about them and maybe some of the things that you've learned, some of the things that people might not know about them in relation to Elvis.
I think probably my favorite person to discuss is Calvin Newborn because he is the one of these real primary influences. Well, let me back up for a second and just explain why these people. So the book is structured to give the African American roots of one major aspect of Elvis's thing. His first hit song, his biggest hit song, his first love in music, which was gospel music, his what a lot of people think is his best recording being Mystery Train, but then finally his stage presence. And, it wasn't, he was a recording artist for a year and a half before he became a full on just phenomenon. And that occurred after he appeared on television because people saw him for the first time. And so that's when Elvis the Pelvis was born. Well, that style of stage presentation, that those dance moves, he learned by watching Calvin Newborn. One of the main characters in this book was a person who I had the privilege of getting to know. Calvin and his brother Phineas Jr. were musical prodigies. Calvin, a guitar player, and Phineas Jr., a piano player. And they grew up playing live with Lionel Hampton, making records at Sam Phillips' studio before it was even called Sun Records. And so, I mean, they were involved. Even, and I went on tour with Jackie Brenston for the Rocket 88 tour,
Mm.
what a lot of people think of as the first rock and roll record. This is
Yeah.
like before they turn 18 and graduate from high school. They had all of these just formative experiences. They're both so gifted, so talented, and had all these great experiences. And so Calvin and they were part of a family band. Their dad was a drummer and band leader who put together 8-piece orchestra, I think, to entertain in the nightclubs around Memphis, one of which was called the Flamingo Room on
Mm.
Beale Street. And so right in the summer of 1954, right after the Supreme Court's decision to shoot down legal segregation in the Brown versus Board of Education case, at that moment, the Flamingo Room, like Reverend Brewster's church had in the previous year, opened its doors to white patrons. And there are a lot of stories that I heard around Memphis about Elvis hanging out in the Flamingo Room. And so that ended up being one thing that I really wanted to investigate and get to the bottom of to see what really happened. And was really thrilled to not only hear from Calvin Newborn himself about how these things occurred, but to hear from so many other musicians who were there and who witnessed the same thing, because they all saw Elvis there. They all saw him kind of studying Calvin's moves, his hip shaking and his gyrating. Calvin was a guitarist and a showman. And so, I mean, he would be like jumping off the stage, doing splits, sliding across the dance floor on his knees. He had the, 5,000-foot guitar cord, and he'd follow ladies into the restroom and all this stuff. Like, he was crazy. And Calvin told me that he learned about that type of dancing by traveling with this particular R&B band and watching the ladies go crazy when the saxophone player would, thrust his hips. I didn't mean to get into it there, but would thrust his hips, and he's like, "Hey, that worked for him, so it worked for me." So, there's nothing um, magical or deeply mysterious about it when you really when you really know what happened and what the motives are. But yeah, Elvis learned those moves hanging out at the Flamingo Room on Beale Street and watching Calvin Newborn.
Mm.
So man, it was cool to get to know Calvin, to get to know some of his people, and to get to hear the stories about his brother. I mean, I urge everybody to go listen to Phineas Newborn Jr. I mean, he was considered the greatest living jazz pianist of his generation on a
So
level.
Calvin's still with us.
Calvin's gone. He
Oh,
died in 2018 or 2019.
how old was he?
He was, let me see off the top of my head. So I think he was born in 32 or 33. So yeah, he would have been about 85.
Okay.
His brother had died in 1988 or 89, died fairly young, but was, considered to be on the level of Art Tatum as far as, solo jazz piano brilliance goes.
Mm.
And, there's this narrative out there that Elvis stole from black artists and didn't, show them the proper respect or pay them the proper royalties. And that's a whole issue in the book that
Yeah.
we probably don't want to get into here. It's very weedy, but trust us, it's covered in the book. It's all there. But I thought Calvin Newborn's take on all of that was so interesting because if anybody could have beef with Elvis, it would be the guy who showed him how to dance, right? I mean, because that's really what rocketed Elvis to superstardom was when he got up there and was shaking that pelvis. Well, Calvin and his brother, their goal was to get to what they called the jazz mountaintop. And that's exactly what they did. And so, right practically to the day that Elvis first appeared on TV, the Newborn brothers were in New York City and they were performing at Birdland. And their first recording was coming out, I think, on Atlantic. Eventually, Phineas moved over to RCA. And so both he and Elvis were on the exact same label at the exact same time,
Mm,
getting the same kind of level of praise about their excellence. Nobody ever put together the fact that they came from practically the exact same band. They had the exact same influences, very similar experiences, a lot of, shared time with the exact same people at the exact same time. In one direction, with Elvis, it's superstardom unlike anything that anybody had ever seen. In the other direction, with Phineas, it was the greatest jazz piano anybody had ever heard, all coming from that root of the Memphis blues.
mm, mm. That's that's interesting because anybody that follows Elvis, you get just it runs the gamut of all these influences. I mean, it goes from Dean Martin.
Right.
People say Dean Martin, and then they bring up a guy named Jake Hess, and then they start bringing up like the gospel quartets, and there's just a whole hodgepodge. But I'm
Which I
I'm
think is all valid.
yeah.
I mean, he had a lot of influence, had a lot of picked up a lot of tricks from a lot of different people for sure.
One thing in the book, and I want to bring this up too, is kind of maybe devil's advocate or get your take on it.
Yeah.
The book asserts that Elvis is the most important musician in American history. Yet, if you listen to what Elvis said in the 68 comeback, I think it was a 68 comeback. He says, I don't well, it was during a live performance. He says, I don't actually play guitar.
hmm
He says, I play a couple chords. That's it,
hmm
right? And so when I think of musicianship, I'm thinking Chuck Berry and his relation to his guitar.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. An
Because he's
instrument, in
playing
other
guitar,
words.
and he's like probably the first singer-songwriter in rock, right? Because he
Yep.
composed his own stuff and he played. And then you also have Little Richard and Fats Domino.
That's yeah.
And I remember Albert Goldman talking about or writing about Little Richard and how Elvis, it was his guitar was like a prop,
Pretty much.
right?
Yeah.
He was kind of like this machine gun kind of prop, whereas Little Richard behind the piano was more, I don't want to say subdued, but it was more kind of constrained. It was like, being behind that piano was a little bit constrained. Um, so when I read
hmm
musician, I'm thinking, well, he didn't actually play the guitar, admittedly, right? He admittedly
Yeah,
said
yeah,
he didn't
yeah.
play the guitar. And then, he didn't really write any of his songs, even though he did get
You got publishing
co-authorship
on everything.
on some of the Otis Blackwell compositions, and I think
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Axton with Heartbreak Hotel. But can you address that? Because some people might,
No, I like that. In fact, I have definitely heard from people who object to that. But oddly enough, you're bringing up a different point, which is calling him a musician, right? Which to me, I didn't even think twice about. Like that part, I did not say in order to be provocative in any way,
right,
because
right,
I consider him a musician. I consider as a vocalist, I mean, that's as musical as anything. Being able to sing like that and to be able to evoke emotion, and to express feelings that you can't really put words to. Like to me, that's what music does. An instrument, can express and can sound out things that you can't put into words, that you can't express any other way. And so I think that the voice functions in that same manner. Um, and he was a great arranger too. I mean, his arrangements and his attention to detail on his recordings and to his performances, uh, when there wasn't too much Seconal involved, are legendary. He was a highly detail oriented arranger when it came to how the songs were put together and how they functioned. So that would be my thought in using that word musician.
Mm,
Most people object to the most important part about it, right? That
right.
phrase. And so obviously that's my opinion, but it's based on the facts of the impact that Elvis has had. I don't think anybody has been quite as important or as impactful to American culture. Um, Certainly the king of rock and roll, if not the inventor, which I don't think he was. And I think that the level of discourse and the discussions that go on. So I mean, you have like just regular, you have millions of just kind of regular fans who, over the past, how long is it now? 70 years have just gone crazy for the stuff that he's done. There's that aspect. And then you have, nerds like me who can deep dive on the cultural meaning of everything that he has done. There's a huge, maybe not huge, there's a sizable segment of people like that. There are people like you who appreciate kind of the history and the culture and how it all fits together. So that to me is importance. When you can pull all of those different type interest groups, different types of fans together uh, in one package, like that's, I don't know who else does that. I know the Beatles are certainly, as if you want to consider them a single artist, they have generated more recordings and more, I guess, more books. Um, but I just love Elvis's appeal to intellectual work and to just regular fans. There's nothing like it.
There's been a
And
lot of books, ranging from his his life as an artist, musician, to his wardrobe. There have been
yeah,
books, there have been cookbooks on
right.
Elvis's favorite. I mean, it just kind of runs
You
the,
don't want to live that way though. You definitely want to keep that in moderation.
yeah, I mean, it just kind of runs the gamut. I did bring up Albert Goldman because I know that the Goldman book came out in the early 80s.
Hmm.
That was a pretty controversial book. I think Goldman had received some death threats over some of the depictions of Elvis. But there were a couple of points that he did make. He said that Elvis's voice was described as phonogenic. That he had just a pleasing
Yeah.
voice, uh, and how it related to the technology as well. That he had a pretty wide octave range,
Hmm.
and that his image was second only to Mickey Mouse,
Hmm.
as far as recognizability, over a
During
wide.
that
I
time.
think it was like second only to Mickey Mouse. Um, but
And
another
that's
thing,
that's that's a little bit of what I'm drawing my importance from is that recognizability. Um, yeah, there's just never been anybody else quite like it.
yeah, another thing, Goldman, you know, did a whole deep dive on just on a lot of different levels. But one of the things that I remembered about his book is that, he spoke on the machinery behind some of the early records, the
Hmm.
machinery behind it. And what he said was that, there would be a demo that would come in that was pressed, I guess.
Yeah.
Like, Blackwell would send in a demo, they would listen
Yeah.
to it, thumbs up or thumbs down. And according to Goldman, that they play it and then they followed it so closely. They say, Goldman said that they followed it down to the breath. And it
Hmm.
became kind of like this, it almost became like an assembly line, word for word, breath for breath. Um, I mean, in your research, were you able to kind of, can you touch on that or?
On a demo, I can't really say. I think that if that's the story, if that's the evidence, then fine. In terms of, you know, remakes or covers, I feel like Elvis chose material that he wanted to interpret. I think he wanted to do something different and say something different.
Mm,
One of the controversies when it gets to white artists and black artists during the 1950s, and particularly white artists doing remakes or covers of black records, is, is it an instant note for note rendition? Is it just a rip off? That to me is the difference between a remake and a rip off. Is does this song, whether it's Hound Dog or Mystery Train, both fine examples of Elvis doing remakes, or That's All Right Mama for that, all of them have an Elvis, a uniquely Elvis quality to them, whether it's in the arrangement, whether it's in the presentation. It's material that I feel like he wants to work with, that it's saying something that he wants to contribute to rather than just, the Pat Boone Tutti Frutti kind of, oh, I'm going to sing this because it's popular and people are buying it and I can sell it. I think that Elvis's song selection comes down to whether it got the thumbs up or the thumbs down. I think it really had to say something that he wanted to interpret and to add to.
Hmm. Yeah, you brought up Hound Dog. I know that there were a couple of versions of that. I know Big Mama Thornton had,
Right.
with 1953, she had that
Yep.
version, and it was on tour with Johnny Otis and the Barrel
Yep.
House,
Yep.
but then there was another version by what the Bellhop. What was the name of that group? The Bellhop.
Um, right. Yes. Somebody Bell and the Bellhops. Yeah.
Freddie
Yeah.
and
Freddie Bell. Yeah.
Freddie Bell. You know that version is actually not bad. I mean, I've listened to it a few times. It's not bad.
And
Uh,
that supposedly that arrangement is the basis for Elvis's version,
mm,
rather than like if you listen to the Big Mama Thornton, the song was written for her,
yeah.
specifically. And you can hear her personality, how the story and the lyrics play to her persona, which was big, tough,
Yeah.
don't want to mess with, might get cut with a razor kind of kind of a
Well,
gal.
and then
She's
when
vocally so strong.
then she recorded it, and then it kind of went on the back burner, and then
Yeah.
I guess she had to go on the road. She had
Right.
forgotten the song, and then she
Yeah.
had to buy her own record to relearn to to
No, that was a really cool story. Yeah, so she cut it. I don't know if they recorded it in I think the story was that what they recorded Hound Dog in Los Angeles while they were touring. And they just had a weekend off, or probably more likely a midweek off. And so they cut the song and maybe another one. And it got thrown in the vault for whatever reason and not immediately released. Well, she got a call to do a show with Johnny Ace, and had to hot foot it up there quickly. And as she was pulling up to the theater, she saw her name up there on the
oh
marquee,
yeah.
and she's feeling good about this and flips on her car radio and starts to hear herself doing the song, and then realizes it's a hit, and that's where the demand for her show is coming from, and that she doesn't even know the song anymore. So yeah, she had to run over to the record store and buy a copy and set up a record player in her dressing room and go over the lyrics again to do the song that night. And then she probably got sick of it pretty quickly.
There was a story in the book, because I think Hound Dog was a Lieber and Stoller
Yes.
composition. It was something about her in the studio, and she had made some kind of remark to one of the writers. She pointed at her crotch. What was that? I mean, it was something.
So, all right. This happens with songwriters and songs. They'll be there kind of coaching the vocalist to sing with a certain emphasis,
Right, right.
sing it a certain way. And I can't remember her exact words, but one of these little 19-year-old Jewish boys from Brooklyn was trying to tell her, you know, you got to attack the song,
Oh
you
yeah,
know.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
She's
yeah,
fucking Big Mama Thornton. Give me a break, right? And
yeah,
she's got the scars to prove it. And so she grabbed her crotch and said, "Why don't you attack this?"
yeah, yeah. That's it. That's it. That's
And
it.
Johnny Otis was on the drums at the time for the recording and gave her a quick ba
And when I read that, I was like, I mean, talk about a life, and I
Yes,
think she had made, I think, $500 from the recording, and
right.
there was the whole thing with the record company, and just all these things that go along with with business, right? How cutthroat that could be. Again, this is Listen and Be Heard Radio. We're speaking with Preston Lauterbach, and this is the book called Before Elvis. This is a wonderful read, um, an education on music, but also kind of a history lesson too on some of the things that were going on uh, around the time that and before the time that Elvis became a big star, things that were going on in Memphis, things that are really telling about society and that setting. Um, as far as just overall message of the book, what do you want people to take away?
Oh, I think that these influences should be household names. I think that everybody should understand, who these people were and what their personalities were, what they were like, what their lives were all about. And so it's illuminating both to those stories, and then I think you also learn something about Elvis as a person as well, because as much as has been written about him, and as many movies have been made about him, um, he is a sort of not obscure figure. He's mysterious. He was a private person in a lot of ways. Once he became an addict, he and a superstar, he lived like a vampire. I mean, he had to protect himself from the public, seemingly at any cost. And so his existence got to be very weird very early on. And of course, his life ended at the age of 42, which is just not very much time. But to look at these artists, you understand the appeal and you understand what he respected about them. And that shows you something about Elvis that hopefully people didn't already know and will enjoy getting into.
Yeah, the age of 42, but was it August 9th, 1977?
16th.
August 16th, 1977. Um,
Same
yeah,
death date as Robert Johnson and Aretha Franklin. So it's just kind of Kings and Queens Day.
oh yeah. I remember. I remember when that happened. God, I was living in Orlando, Florida, and I had a job mowing lawns for a buck and a buck a shot.
Nice.
And so, but uh, but anyway, I want to just read an excerpt because blues and music and the pain from which that comes from has been
Yeah.
influential on many writers. And I just want to read a little excerpt from James Baldwin from
Yeah.
Uses of the Blues. And he writes, Bessie Smith, who is dead now, came out of somewhere in the Deep South. I guess she was born around 1898. A great blues singer, died in Mississippi after a very long, hard, not very long, but very hard life. Pig's feet and gin, many disastrous lovers, and a career that first went up, then went down. Died on the road on the way from one hospital to another. She was in an automobile accident and one of her arms was wrenched out of its socket. And because the hospital attendants argued whether or not they could let her in because she was colored, she died. Not a story Horatio Alger would write. Um, Again, this is a new book by Preston Lauterbach. Name is spelled Lauterbach. Before Elvis. And inside the image of Elvis, we have B.B. King, Big Mama Thornton, um, Junior Parker, Otis Blackwell on the bottom here. I'm not sure
Yeah.
if this is on the in the middle here.
Well, there's Arthur Crudup behind the
Arthur
mic. Oh,
Crudup,
that's
yeah.
Calvin Newborn. That's Calvin Newborn. So
Oh,
Calvin and
Calvin
Arthur
Newborn.
are kind of side by side. Yeah.
Gotcha.
All the
The
main characters of the book, with the exception of Brewster. For some reason, I guess, people think gospel doesn't sell, which is true.
Again, this is a book. It's called Before Elvis, the African American musicians who made the king by author Preston Lauterbach. And not only has he written this book, he's also written many other books, including The Chitlin Circuit, as well as Two Secret Histories of Black Culture, Beale Street Dynasty, and Bluff City. He also co-authored three memoirs with significant figures in Black music, including Brother Robert, which was written with the stepsister of bluesman Robert Johnson, Timekeeper with Memphis soul drummer Howard Grimes, and The Spirit of the Century with the Boys of Alabama. His works have earned Book of the Year recognition from Wall Street Journal, NPR, and Rolling Stone. He lives near Charlottesville, Virginia. Preston, thank you so much for being on our program. It was wonderful having you. For people that want to get your books or know more about your work or find out when your readings are or events and things like that, how can they go about doing that?
Best place would probably be my website, which is just prestonlauterbach.info. I think you can probably just search for the book Before Elvis
Mhm.
and get there that way also. But yeah, Preston Lauterbach being a little bit of a mouthful, I'm glad you already spelled it so I don't have to.
Fantastic. Again, Preston Lauterbach, that's Lauterbach. And you can check him out on his website, Before Elvis. And once again, this is Listen and Be Heard Radio for Readers and Writers, the Audio Garden. And we're going to toss it back to Martha in the studio.